everybody. Welcome to the Monday episode of the Donovan Bandits. I'm Orrin Phillips, and we have a home run of a show for you today. Two guests. We have Mr. Jim Keefe, the man behind the art of the Flash Gordon comic strip, and writer and artist Vannotes returns to the show. They are talking about teaching young people about how to get into the comic industry. Both of them do so. They have courses. They talk to young folks, and it's so important because we want to keep comic books going, and we need new blood and we need new people in the industry. So they have some really wonderful insight as to where we are right now and our kids interested in getting into this profession. So without further ado, here is Jim and Vannotes. We have two wonderful guests today. We have returning guest Vannotes and first time on the show, Mr. Jim Keefe. Guys, thank you so much for jumping on.
Thanks for the invite. I appreciate it greatly.
Not a problem.
I'm glad I was able to drag Jim into another wild misadventure. So,
well, I want to get into how you guys met in a second, but Jim, because you're the rookie on the show, let's start at the beginning. How did you first discover comics?
Oh my God. It's one of those things where, so my age group, you go into, man, I'm sounding really old here, but you go into a drugstore, there's comics. You go into a 7-Eleven, there's comics. There was such a wealth of it out there where I almost feel like today's kids, they're finding out about superheroes and stuff from movies. They don't pick them up from, the source material, just that's not where they get the introduction of the character anymore. So it was very much, I got into comics by drugstores and, this, that, and the other thing. And then when I was 12 years old, Stan Lee and John Romita started the Spider-Man newspaper strip, which just, that was in our local paper. And just like Romita is one of my favorites, as I probably have said a million times in other interviews, but it was one of those cases where his artwork was just so damn good, and he knew how to tell a story, and he knew the medium. And between that and the comic books I grew up on, that was my introduction.
And this question is going to kind of bleed into what we talk about a little later on, but how did the decision come to be for you to get into this field?
Well, and I'm sure for younger people listening, entering the art field, being a comic book artist, being a cartoonist, being an animator, when you're in high school, it's kind of like, oh, I want to be an astronaut. It's like, how do you do that? That makes no sense. There's no linear line to do it. And once again, dating myself, when I went to school, comic books were just not considered, they were just frowned on. It wasn't an art form. It wasn't until the 80s with Mouse and Watchmen and Dark Knight that all of a sudden it got on the New York Times bestseller list, and it was seen something, first of all, that could make big money for another group of people, but it wasn't considered a serious art form. And even those first ventures, a lot of people were like, yeah, but it's still a comic book. It's not like a real thing. So it didn't seem viable whatsoever. But then at the same time, like Wally Wood is from Minnesota, Charles Schultz is from Minnesota, Kurt Swan is from Minnesota. You have this just huge number of people from this state. So it was a case of like, oh, I guess you can do that. It isn't. And now I'll hog up this whole conversation. So I'm just one more brief thing too. Like when I started, I ended up going to the Kubert School, which we'll get into later, but it was a case where digital wasn't a thing. Like you weren't seeing web stuff online. You weren't seeing comics online. That wasn't a thing when I started school in the 90s. That's when that started. I started in the 80s at the Kubert School. So you had to go where it was being produced. It wasn't a case of you could learn online or, where what you can do now. There's a lot more information open to people. As far as doing comics, I had to go out east to really dive into it like I wanted to.
Makes sense.
So do you want to hear what's wild, Jim? So I was doing a portfolio review with some of the Boise Comic Art Festival. The library does a mentee program with, 16 to 17-year-olds, getting them prepared, giving them a stipend so that they can purchase things for their table. And then they bring in some local artists. It was me and another artist, Julia Green. We both came in and we were doing portfolio reviews. And so I was asking one of the mentees, and this isn't to like, you know, be an old man shaking his fist at a cloud like kind of situation, but it was just so shocking to me. The mentee told me, I was like, oh wow, this is really cool. You're doing this fan art of Delicious in Dungeon, which is a really big, the anime's on Netflix right now. It's really big. The manga's huge. And I go, it's great. What do you like about Ryoko Kui's art? And the mentee goes, well, I don't really read the manga and I don't watch the anime, but I follow a bunch of people on Instagram who draw fan art, and I really like that stuff. And my mind was just blown as I was like trying to be like, oh, okay, so what are some artists you like? And she spouted off some like handles, but I was like, well, what are their names? And she was like, I don't know. And
Oh my God.
so yeah, they're not going to the 7-Eleven and picking up single issues.
No, oh my God. That's just it. Yeah, it is. And once again, it is kind of the lack of knowledge in the people that actually do the art always amazes me. I mean, any kid knows who Spider-Man is. And and I won't even get into comic books. The people who love Into the Spider-Verse or any other, cartoon movie, Marvel Universe movie, they don't know, especially with the animated Into the Spider-Verse, they have no clue who's doing that artwork or what it's influenced by. Like I saw Into the Spider-Verse when you have the Kingpin, how he's, this just bulk of a character. And it's like, I'm looking at it going, oh my gosh, that's Bill Sienkiewicz. That's from a Frank Miller story. He did that imagery. And you have such like that's why you need good teachers, good instructors to really like say, hey, this is where this stuff is coming from.
So let's start at the beginning. How did you two
go ahead.
first meet, and what was the bond between you guys?
Yeah, I'm gonna hand that off to you because it's a blur for me.
So this is the dirty secret of me and Jim Keefe, and saying that we got to know each other at the Minneapolis College of Art and Design. I never had a class with Jim, actually. I was never officially a student of Jim Keefe.
Well, it's funny because so many students I'm connected with, sometimes they weren't even in my class, but they was like, oh, you should. It was one of those cases where we hooked up even though I wasn't your instructor.
Yeah, and so I think I came in with a very good class of students at the Minneapolis College of Art and Design. I grew up in Idaho here, and at that time, there was none of the comics programs that have now popped up all over Oregon, which would have been much easier for me to go to. The closest comics program, there was three options essentially at that time. It would have been going to School of Visual Arts in New York, which that was totally, going to New York would have been like going to an alien planet. That was definitely not going to happen. There was Savannah College of Art and Design. And I'd been to the South once before, and I was like, I don't like humidity. And I think I know that about myself as a person. Especially humidity without rainfall. So the next closest one was Minneapolis. And I never spent a summer there, so I never had to experience humid Minneapolis summers. But yeah, so
No one knows that's a thing.
So yeah, I went out to Minneapolis. I did 4 years at Minneapolis College of Art and Design, and at some point I just Jim Keefe was a beloved figure, just a delightful, kooky character within the comics program. And Jim would always be the one with a camera that would come around at events. And you had to be camera ready for Jim if he was stopping by your table. So, you had to, quick, I had long flowing blonde hair at that point. Still, there was still hair for me to uh, mess with. But yeah, Jim was kind of that, and everyone loved Jim. So that was kind
Well, and
of
I really, as far as the camera, I really wanted to promote you guys. Like, get you on social media, get your stuff out there. You guys were doing just incredible stuff. So it's a matter of, oh, we gotta, because now they have Autoptic, they have those art festivals connected to the school. But it was like you'd have like the mini Comic Cons in the school and such every year.
mhm.
Like, and that's so limited to just pretty much the student body. It's not getting out into the public as much as I would have, just that wasn't the nature of it. It's, a comic convention for the students there. But just to get your stuff out there, I'd be taking pictures left and right.
Yeah, no, and it was you would get, I think I still have some web results with Jim Keefe as my photographer. That are still, within the top 1 or 2 pages of Google. So no, it was yeah, and Jim was just very supportive, very like pushing students to get out there more. And then I've just kind of stayed in touch with Jim over social media, and there's always things that pop up where it's like, oh yeah, this person would be great to have, this person would be great to have. And we really got to connect to this last year. Jim came out for Bordertown Comic Con here in Ontario, Oregon. That was that was a wacky misadventure I lured him into. I was super glad. It was great to have him out this way. And I know we'll get him for Boise Comic Arts Festival. One year I'll snag him for that, getting him out this way. But no, and Jim's continued to be wildly supportive of not just me, but all the students that came through MCAD under his watchful eye. So
Well, what I really am drawn to is the students' enthusiasm. Like your guys, the output you're doing, like I know the work that goes into this stuff. Like it isn't, there's people who do it as a hobby, which is great. And then there's the people who just do the deep dive and are just constantly pushing themselves and doing new kinds of stuff. And that really inspires me. So I'm like, oh, I gotta, I gotta like follow this person. And a bunch of people from MCAD, once they get into like third and fourth year, where that energy level, as far as the stuff they're producing and trying new stuff, it's like it once again, like I feed off that as a instructor. You really learn from your students because sometimes you can get really, your stuff can kind of, it's a job and you're just pumping out the stuff and you just need that kind of fire in your belly every so often.
When you guys are teaching, what are some talent indicators that you guys can spot to say, okay, this has potential, or this person has potential to really blossom in this? What are some little things that you look for that stand out maybe from other art that you see?
I would say, and once again, using the students at MCAD as an example, it's that one of those things where just they keep putting out, there's the output. There isn't, they keep putting out stuff. It may be kind of rough around the edges. That's fine. They're in college. It's not supposed to be perfect. But as far as just to keep at it and keep putting your stuff out there and seeing you at conventions, and that's why I'm taking pictures. It's like, oh, they're doing more stuff. This is fantastic. So one of it is the dedication to the craft. Because you can always, I see a lot of work and there's so many, everyone can improve, but it's the people who are just diligent and really have that discipline that really makes the difference, as far as, because if you're not producing the art, you're not being seen, and you also have to have that extra level of getting your stuff out there, which it's incredibly hard. There's such a sea of art out there, and you can get lost so easy. So it's these guys navigating how to do that and how to be seen, which, and granted, I'm even where I'm at, it's the same kind of thing. Like, I do a syndicated newspaper strip. A lot of people don't know those things exist anymore. It's very, it's, getting your stuff out there in front of people. And that's when I see that drive with the students, that level of enthusiasm. I think that's what really makes a difference as far as when I teach students.
Yeah, and I think, the concept of success or talent, that's always so subjective. And it's so student to student. So I primarily, because of my degree, is actually in creative writing rather than an art field. I typically am teaching writing, which is so much more subjective, and so much more. I mean, you can have a student with wonderful grammar, wonderful technical ability, but sometimes the story doesn't hit, or the essay doesn't hit, or whatever they're producing just isn't quite working. But I think, and something I notice with um the students that find that level of whatever their success is, whether it's becoming a better appreciator of the medium. I just did a comic book drawing class with a few students. I work with a local studio called Catalyst Arts Collaborative. I did a comic book drawing class. It was nice. It was a small class of 3 students, and I was able to say, my whole goal for you is, some of you might take this class and you'll say comics are really hard. They take a lot of work. This is not for me. Like, that might be what this class does for you. But along the way, I'm going to show you a bunch of different things. I'm going to pull a bunch of different comics, superheroes, manga, comic strips. I'm going to pull all these things out. I'm going to show you how these things were actually done, and why they were done this way. And that should give you a deeper appreciation of the medium. So even if it's just a little thing, like telling them, where eyes come from. The reason why anime eyes look the way they do is because Osamu Tezuka sat down in a movie theater and watched Bambi like 50 times. Like, that's where anime eyes come from. At least if you walk out with something like that, or you're just like, man, someone sits down and, actually writes all these things, draws all these things. Lettering's actually important.
Well,
Um,
that's when you mentioned even what your favorite artists, who they're inspired by. Like, that
yeah,
gets into a whole different level. That, like, once again, my favorite is Romita. Well, he's influenced by Sickles and Kniff, and then you're following those artists. Same kind of thing. Like, to be able to point that out to the students.
yeah. So I
Fantastic.
pulled out a Alex Raymond, Flash Gordon, and I was like, this is what inspired all the people, essentially, of all the comic books that you're seeing. This is Flash Gordon is one of those, like, key texts that, like, Jack Kirby, like, was just like reading Flash Gordon and it was burning into his mind, which then goes on to influence Star Wars and all those other things, which are huge pop culture phenomenon. So, like, yeah, even just kind of making that connection, or being like, hey, do you know why all these comics are printed with like such thick black and white artwork? And they were like, oh no, why do they do all this? And I was like, well, it's because of printing technology, because you needed to have really sharp, high contrast black and whites for when you would actually have to like use a camera to like photograph all these things. So yeah, and even just some of that technical stuff, are like, oh yeah, this is why this weird little thing is the way it is. Like, developing appreciation for the medium is also, something involved in teaching. Because yeah, I could, sit down and teach a student, how to draw a figure, but does that develop their interest in comics, or I could help a student learn how to draw a 16 panel page, but is that really their goal with the story they're working on? So really taking where the students' interests are, especially those portfolio reviews yesterday. I could have, that student I was talking to, I could have pulled out my cigar and started chomping on it and, tearing up artwork or whatever, or, tearing the student apart for, not respecting the medium and all the artists who've come before. But instead, that's just an opportunity to say, oh, like, it looks like you're really influenced by this kind of stuff. This is the artist who is influencing these people. Sometimes it's good to go back to the source and check in and see what was really exciting to them.
I've sort of a two-part one, and Vannotes, I'm going to start with you as far as writing goes. With the writing for comics these days, are a lot of the students focusing on sort of a one-shot story, or learning, or are they trying to taking one story and maybe spread it out to 4 or 5 issues, to fill a run? What's the social mentality now for writers?
Oh, every student I met with yesterday has a 600-page graphic novel series in their
I will
head.
second that. That is every student.
Which is great. I wish I was sitting down and I was trying to do a 1-page like little fold up zine the other day, and I was like, I have no ideas. I have nothing for this blank piece of paper right now. But no, they all have like uh, the biggest thing is
Do you
helping
think
them.
that's the manga influence?
No,
Like,
because I
because
had
they are
that
such
too.
huge storylines.
Yeah. Like even when I think I was coming up and I loved superhero comics, it was like, oh yeah, I want to do my 100 issues, like Jack Kirby on Fantastic Four, or like Bone. Bone was coming out. Bone was like 9 volumes. Like it was this big story. I think just yeah, I think young people are just attracted to like these big, giant, epic arcs for whatever reason. And then you have to actually start working on them. And then your ambitions, I think, naturally shrink to a certain extent. Or at least you figure out how to parcel it out. But that was the conversation I was having with one student was like, okay, so he was telling me he had all these pieces of uh butcher paper, and they were, cluttering the desk, all that kind of thing. And I was like, so what are you doing with these things? Like what are you gonna take and do that with? And so I worked through that student just saying like, okay, here's, I write in a program called Scrivener, and there's a bunch of other programs you can use to write, but start like jotting some of these things down, and then you have like a 600-page story here. What can we do with 1 page? What could you do that's like 3 pages, and see, because if you get stuck in that like idea cloud too long, it gets hard to come down the mountain, and
Yeah.
interact with.
I would
Yeah.
generally say, like, hey, try to do a scene from your 600-page. Let's do a 5-page scene from your 600-page novel you want to do. As far as let's get something on paper. Same kind of thing. It's funny how you said, like, some of them really figure out, oh, how much work that is involved with this kind of stuff. And it kind of like, oh, I don't know about this. Like, between the first and second year of Kubert School, we lost like a third to half of the students. Like, it was like a lot of people are like, oh, I love comics, I do not want to work on them. That's insane to do that. So it whittled you down. By the time the third year came around, you were whittled down to, here's the students who really want to focus on comics.
And Jim, my question for you is, I forget who I was speaking to, but somebody said, you know what, for art, you can create a beautiful splash page and it's going to look fantastic, but can you draw the mundane panel of someone just sitting at a control panel or a conversation?
Oh
How
my
do you
God.
that it's not just about, putting all this detail into one page. You have to break out all these different panels to create a whole comic.
Well, and I look sometimes, I'm going to give you 2 examples really quick. Like, when I was doing Flash Gordon, I wrote it myself. So I think when you have the writer who's also the artist, the story is generally just more visual. It just, because of the nature of the writer is the artist. I mean, it goes hand in hand. And it seems of late being the last 10 to 15 years, it's a writer's medium more so now. So you have so many. I read comic books and it's just people talking as opposed to it's not a Jack Kirby comic to me.
Right.
You know, as far as like when I grew up, Romita and Kirby and Ditko, it was fast paced. They had 20 pages to tell an entire story.
Mhm.
Now there is longer stories. There's graphic novels. So you have just pages and pages of dialogue with the characters talking, which great, you know, that's if it moves the story. But at the same time, I feel sorry for some of these artists who just have to, here's 5 pages of these characters having a conversation, how to make that interesting. And, you know, and go into comic strips. I do the Sally Forth comic strip, lots of comic strips. The jokes are in the script. It isn't the visual medium it used to be because of the nature of how small the drawings are these days. So a lot of the strips, if you look at them, it's characters talking. So how do you make that interesting?
Mm-hmm.
And I think a young cartoonist can be thrown by that because they are looking to do those visual imagery that, you know, that's going to just knock people's socks off. And they end up, it's like, no, this is just a few people at a table talking for the next 7 pages. And a conversation, once again, it is a matter of making that conversation visually interesting with, you know, in conjunction with the dialogue. So it is hard. It is hard in that sense.
Mm-hmm.
Because I think some people are expecting it, that visual aspect of it. I don't see that the same way.
Right.
There's so much. It seems like a lot of comic book writers are writing their movie script. Like they're not writing a comic book. It's a different medium. It's a different pacing.
Mm-hmm.
And even when people say, oh, comic books are like storyboards, they are not. There's aspects you can say are similar, but they're not the same. So you have a bunch of those issues as far as an artist entering the field right now.
And we, in the middle grade, like kind of sphere that I tend to operate in, it's interesting because, you know, the middle grade graphic novel space has so much overlap with traditional like children's publishing. They'll bring in writers who are, you know, great prose writers, you know, really great, you know, they write wonderful sequences of dialogue, they're really snappy. But then you do have that problem of visuals where, you know, a bunch of, you know, characters having, you know, heightened emotional interactions or exchanges, you know, that can be great, you know, in a prose script or a prose story, but as a comic, it's not very interesting to draw. And they also don't have the direction to kind of excite the artist about it, you know, because you might have, you know, there's whole scenes in manga which are just conversations floating around, the characters, you know, are just talking back and forth, but there'll be like this heightened visual imagery for like different emotional exchanges. You know, if someone's blushing, all of a sudden there will be roses, you know, like floating around them. Or if someone says something stupid, you know, lightning will flash across the panel. And if you're just a prose writer, you know, you don't know that those are some visual tricks that you could use to make that
Just
10-page
amp it up.
conversation, yeah, actually work.
Well,
Because yeah, there's so much good manga that's just like people talking to one another or like someone cooking a meal. But you
oh
have to
yeah,
know how to
amazing
heighten
manga.
it. Yeah.
I think of it too, just that whole matter of like there's incredible dialogue that can be gotten, you know, you can get across in a comic book. I think, you know, Alan Moore has, you know, just like these big blocks of script, but he knows the medium where the imagery works with the script. You know, it's not like here's a script and then this is an image that just mirrors it and such. And I think it's interesting too, like Charles Schultz pointed this out with, if you have a writer who's not the artist, when he's drawing something, he'll push the art, the joke may go somewhere else just because he's drawing it. And visually, like you said with the manga, how you can do something with the character that it really makes it pop. Sometimes he'll go a different direction because visually he's at the drawing table thinking of stuff where that's not the writer's headspace when they're writing the dialogue. They're not thinking of the drawing in the same way as the artist is, and they're not at the table drawing it. Because I mean, I'm very fortunate with Francesco, who writes Sally Forth. If I go off in a weird tangent to his script, he's like, run with it. I'm good. And because that's not always the case with writers and artists. And you end up just like butting heads, and it ends up for a bad comic.
There's a 800-pound gorilla that sort of entered the conversation the past couple of years, and that's AI. What are your guys' thoughts on it? And yeah.
Oh, excuse me, I don't know what that was.
Is it a necessary evil, or is it going to be a personal choice as to whether or not you want to use it?
I'm gonna jump in. Right now, and I'm gonna use this isn't the best example. I think of like, even when you write something, when you use your phone to transcribe your dialogue, you have to go in afterwards and correct it. It just is like, yeah, that isn't what I intended. And with all this AI prompts, it's like, oh yeah, but that character shouldn't have 7 fingers on one hand. If you have someone who's using AI, I have such a guttural, just like, they're not, it's kind of like a lot of people, I'm worried about the people using it as a shortcut because they don't know how to draw, they don't know how to design, they put in these prompts, they come out with the image that they don't even know doesn't work, that it's just like this mess, but it's kind of like a shiny object drawing. It like, hey, that's a pretty object unless you really look at it, and it isn't. And so much of the AI is scraping other people's work. That's the huge thing I have against it. It's like, hey, that looks like a Brian Boland drawing, but it isn't. And it's not a good Brian Boland drawing. It's an AI Brian Boland. So the theft aspect is really the theft of other people's art to make your own art is just, it just drives me crazy because anything in defense of it, it's I was actually, I saw this interview with David Bowie, where, and as far as musically, it was like a drum machine. It was like, I forget what they were using, but it was like, hey, here's a drum machine, and it's, anyone knows it's not going to really replace a drummer because a good drummer is a magical thing as far as that amount of talent. But he'd say what they would do is like, oh, we want to take this drum machine, and like I said, the specifics are wrong, but some kind of electronic machine, and we're going to use it not for the purpose it was meant for, but just to make freaking weird sounds, so then we can adapt, use that in our music. So I think you need someone incredibly artistic who can play with this new tool. That's totally different than the person saying, using prompts to scrape other people's art and rip it off, and they don't even know that a hand doesn't have 7 fingers.
Yeah, it's so AI is such a strange beast because the environmental downfalls of it, we're now seeing the effect that running these massive data centers at these high outputs is just so, it's such an environmental detriment. I was reading an article about how if we hadn't moved into this AI direction, we could have gone carbon neutral on the internet. But now we have drastically, gone on this downward slope, which are the amount of screen time we have to begin with is already, there's global, impacts of that, especially in the Congo right now. The fact that all of our rechargeable energies are requiring cobalt mining, which is severely detrimental to the environment and to people. So all that, environmental stuff aside and all the ethics of that, it's AI is just it's an elephant gun that people use to attack a problem. So another good game changer for me in thinking about AI is a terrible name for it because there's no thinking happening.
Right.
There's no intelligence, there's no emotion. It's an applied statistical model. It's a math problem that's essentially being run by the computer. So it's just coming up with a solution to the math problem it thinks that you presented to it. So, and as much as I love the, people who are mathematically minded, not always the greatest art, results from just 1 + 1 = 2. There's those hidden elements that are snuck within it. And the fact that, yeah, you put in an initial prompt and you don't get something you like. So you're like, I'm going to refine the prompt, or I'm going to say, try this again and try this again and try this again. That just continues to shoot this fly with an elephant gun, creatively. And I think the one thing I was telling, there's always this conversation, is print dead? Is print dead? Is physical media dead? If you look at the past, what resulted from high periods of automation, we had the arts and crafts movement of people all of a sudden seeing all this automation that was happening and saying, hey, we want really high quality handcrafted stuff now. We want to see beautiful art because there's a bunch of cheap crap we can get and it's not doing it for us.
Mm-hmm.
So I find myself continuously being like, the physical media, the tangible things are becoming so much more important to me, I guess, as this glut of slop gets shoveled down our throats.
No, and I can't agree with you more as far as like this, the pendulum swings back where it's like, hey, we want something that I think of all like these art books that are coming out with like, here's the original art of this person, and it's, shot from the original pages. And they're even they're high-end books. They cost a lot. People are picking them up because they really are, like, to see Kirby's originals where you're never going to be able to afford anything like that. It's just amazing. The printing that's accessible to us now as far as these collections is just mind-blowing. And I have yet to see anything digital that even is as far as just the creativity that's going on in those pages that is matching it. I mean, once again, it looks like it's almost like AI, some of those AI art pieces. It's like, hey, you like candy? Let's take every candy imaginable and just smash it all together and shove it down your, oh, this will be so good. It's like, this is really, I gotta vomit now. This is nasty.
It is like the shaved ice booths at the fair where they would always have like, what they always call it, toxic sludge or something, or like toxic waste, and that was literally them just putting every flavor together into one bottle. And it's the kind of thing you really love when you're like 10.
Oh yeah.
But as an adult you cannot stomach it, and
it's
I think that's
nasty.
Yeah. I think that,
yeah,
like,
I don't think this is a good commercial for AI, this episode.
yeah, sorry.
Oh, there we go. I want to touch back to something you guys mentioned before, and that's, these students are learning that there's work that comes with this. It's a lot of work. And Jim, I want to start with you for a second because, I mean, you did Flash Gordon, which I think is absolutely amazing. Sally Forth. I remember talking to Guy Gilchrist, who did the Muppets comic strip, and he just said the grind it takes to do a strip. He missed family events, he missed vacations. Like, it has to be in every single week.
It's the never-ending deadline.
How do you sell kids that this is worth it?
I think that's I mean, it is like such a changing market right now. As far the work involved, I mean, there's so much work involved in this field, but I think too, like any field that you enter, as far as being good at something, there's a ton of work involved. And that's where you have the people who are committed to doing it or not. Like, I don't care if you're, I have brothers, I have, family who are electricians and engineers and all different fields. And I think it is the same as far as just the workload, as far as being, you have to be at a certain level. Um, comic strips are a weird medium because it is the never-ending deadline, and you don't. I think you have to find that balance, for lack of a better way to say it. Like, I went for a long time, same as you had mentioned, like missing out on a lot of family stuff, because just the deadline is always present. And it's a way to, I've had to jettison work because of that. Like, it is a matter of like, okay, I got to figure out a different way to go about this, jettison this, do things a little different. So work smarter, to, like, here's the deadline. How much work should I put into this to get it out? Because there's like, I'm doing a New York storyline this summer where Sally Forth and the family go to New York. And I really do want to put in, I mean, New York. So I want to illustrate, today's strip was Bethesda Fountain, and I spent forever on it. I do want a comic strip to come out with that kind of imagery. But, and I talked to the writer, I said, okay, we're doing all this. I need just here, they're just talking on the couch for a while, and have that dialogue with the cartoon, with the writer, and that work balance. The artist has to know when to say no to stuff. And if you're not getting paid, as far as what you're getting paid and the work you're putting into it, there has to be that balance, and you have to figure that out yourself. Because people have driven themselves nuts, because of that. It is a heavy workload, and it takes a big toll physically and mentally. I know a lot of artists, carpal tunnel syndrome and back pains and sciatica and years of being at the desk. It's also figuring out, okay, yes, I have to exercise, I have to eat right, which it's so basic, but it's something you have to do. So as far as like, how do you how do you sell a kid as far as to do this kind of workload? It's like, yeah, don't do a workload that'll kill you.
Right.
Like, you really have to figure out where you're going to say no to stuff, and also, are you getting paid enough to put that amount of work into it? Because and I know starting out it's hard because you're not getting, people aren't willing to spend a lot on you when you're just starting out. So and I went through that myself. I went through the food stamp years.
Yeah.
It not fun.
And for Vannotes, for you, you were talking before, kids coming in with 800 pages of a story they want to do. And hey, that's great. But sometimes you have to take the paid gig and write a story or do a book that you might not be totally in love with, but you have to pay the bills. You have to be flexible in your writing. How do you teach them that, you might have these great ideas, but sometimes you have to sort of bend a little bit and do some other kind of works?
Yeah, I in my day job, which I'm going to be transitioning to full-time freelance work starting in January. Thankfully, I've had a lot of really lucky opportunities, and I have some things in the works. I've had a day job for the last almost 8 years now, working within college student services. And I've been able to say, there's certain points where things were going really well for me in my creative career. There's been points where things have been going really well in my educational career. There's certain high points or milestones, or promotions. And then there's also, as you go through life, when you're talking to 18-year-olds, it's like sometimes things will be going well for you physically, and then all of a sudden you'll break a bone, or you'll suddenly find out you have some new disease or illness, that you never knew was going to pop into your life. Or, it might be, your spiritual well-being, your health, relationships, everything kind of ebbs and flows. But you always want to be kind of having the mindset of, continuing to enjoy life and enjoy what you're doing. Um, and I was having this conversation with my mom, because I was like, why did I was 18 years old. I was this scrawny kid from Idaho who didn't know anything about living in a city, didn't know anyone in the place he was going to. Why did you let me go to a private art school? And why did our family make so many sacrifices and spend all this money? And she was like, well, we knew if we didn't let you do that, you would have hated us. And I was like, wow. Like, and so it really put in perspective, like, oh, the decisions I was making were, um, I just was going to make them anyway, or I was going to find a way to do that. And when you find someone who's really passionate about art and comics and those kinds of things, it's it's a bug where like they can't imagine doing anything else. So then it's like, okay, how do you have a reasonable and happy life with this strange affliction that you've been cursed with? Um, okay, you need to get an ergonomic mouse. Okay, you need to get an ergonomic pencil so you don't like bust your hands up. It's working with people who work in addiction studies, it's kind of harm reduction. You're just trying to make sure that they're reducing the level of harm people are doing to themselves rather than taking it away all of it at once.
Makes sense. Now, one last question for you guys is, the mentality many years ago is if you get on a book or you get on a project, it would be great to have a long run at it, 3-4 years on a comic strip or on a comic book or something like that. And it seems a little bit has changed where it's like, well, I'd rather just do 3 or 4 issues, do a story, jump to a different comic book, jump to a different comic book instead of, knowing you could just be on one book for a long time. Are you seeing that sort of mentality now, or are people maybe getting back to the security of being on a book for a while?
I'll say, because freelance work is you're just jumping around so much. And the problem with doing, hey, I'm doing 3 issues of a book and then I'm gonna jump around, that jumping around, you may not land to jump around to something else. Like, oh, that book's it ends up we're not gonna do that book for another year. There's so many things happening. Like it is weird as far as like I always wanted to do comic books. I got into comic strips. And I worked on Flash Gordon for a number of years. It did not pay the bills. I did teaching, lettering, coloring, all a bunch of different stuff. So as far as where it's going, I think we're kind of entering a new world in that sense, because it is, you don't have, because even the characters, I'm going to take the big two, Marvel and DC, in those kind of jobs. It's very much editorial driven and management driven as far as the movies that are coming out. It's not, you don't have a Jack Kirby, Steve Ditko creating all these characters for a company. You have locked in characters that are being mandated by executives now. So your input into them, it's hard to stay on a book unless you're that, just a rare few have that opportunity. I think I see more as far as jumping around like that. That's incredibly hard. I see more of a market with like young adult graphic novels. Manga is huge, but of course American artists aren't really doing, that isn't the market for American artists. But like young adult graphic novels where you have these, like they're taking off in a way comic books aren't. So like I see more of a push as far as artists going into that field because they see growth in that sense. So it is, as far as the freelance jumping around, oh, that can be maddening as far as if there's that job to jump to.
Yeah, and I think it's hard to, that's not always a decision I think the artists or the writers are wanting to make. That's just where they're getting punted to next, you know, because and not everyone wants to draw, you know, or write 100 issues of the Hulk or whatever, like Peter David. Like people do, you know, crave different opportunities or different things, or often when you jump from one book to another, you can often negotiate a salary raise, which is harder to do when you've been doing it the same way and the sales just kind of stay flat. Um, it sometimes that's a very, you know, clear logistic, and that's why people, you know, jump from job to job, is because, you know, as you're going to the new job, you can often negotiate a salary raise easier than if you stayed at your current one. But I think one of the things that I'm noticing with, you know, a lot of the creators who are doing that mix of licensed work and creator owned work, especially, you know, my age group, the, you know, 30 somethings, now in comics, you know, the license work, you know, definitely pays a bill, you know, it keeps the bills kind of running, but the grind of it, you know, doing young adult graphic novels, the pace at which people are wanting, you know, 110 completely done pages, not
It's
even just
insane.
like, it's not even just pencils, you know, like the schedule of what that would look like if you were just doing the pencils, that would probably be a perfectly fine schedule. But they want pencils, inks, colors, lettering, even sometimes, all on one person, and all within like 4 to 6 months. Like it's a brutal grind. So yeah, any way you can carve out that sweet spot of having some stability while also having like fulfilling and enriching work, it's difficult because it's like you want to feel good about the work that you're doing at the end of the day. And if you're drawing 7 pages of me and a artist I'm working with a pitch on right now, we were chatting, and all of a sudden we did realize we had one of those sequences where we were like, oh, this will be 7 pages of people just looking at a phone. Like they'll just be standing around looking at one phone or a second phone. Um, we can't do this. Like we can't do it to you. We can't do it to me as a writer. Like we gotta make sure that people aren't just looking. And also, it's like, what message are you sending to kids that 7 pages is worth? You know, like
A
life is
nice
about
phone
7.
conversation.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. These are so important that we need to really document it in a kid's graphic novel. Um, but yeah, I think really just we're all striving for that sweet spot, right? In anyone's kind of life or career. But I really think there's this push um to really try and negotiate, okay, the industry's gotten too breakneck. You know, as far as middle grade graphic novels, I think there's a boiling point there where people are kind of saying, hey, we need to pump the brakes on saying we can turn around this many pages fully completed at this rate. Um, I think there's a reckoning that's slowly coming there.
And we are back. Well, I really enjoyed this conversation. Like we said, we want to get Jim back on the down the road, talk about Flash Gordon. But the two of them are doing really great work. And if we can get young people involved in literature and writing and get them into a path for a career and profession, because you don't have to just write comic books. You can do that and you can move it on to other things as well. Both of them have done such a thing. So thankful they took the time to talk about this. And I hope you guys found this interesting as well. Don't worry, gang. We have more episodes coming up for you this week. You're really going to love them. And we will see you next time. Bye.